I'm Julia Hatmaker. I'm a journalist at Place North, and today we are talking about the future of tall buildings in the north of England. Now, I will say it does feel like in the north our ambitions are getting taller and taller. Over in Manchester, there's plans in for a 76-story skyscraper. Here in Leeds, plans are just approved for a 45 hexagonal tower over at Wellington Square. So to talk a little bit more about the future of tall buildings in this part of the world, I have joining me Wesley Dodds, director at Enjoy Design, and I have Darren Payne, director at DP Squared and D. Simone Company. Darren, why don't you start us off? What is the future of tall buildings in the UK?
I think tall buildings have quite a positive future. The definition of tall is really just anything that's slightly taller than things that are around it. But I think there should be a desire for actually pushing that, 100, 150, 200 metres. Those sort of size buildings sort of fit within a city landscape sort of quite well, particularly the urban centres of Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, as you said, and even Newcastle. Birmingham has got a similar sort of collection of sort of tall buildings. So I think it's a very positive future, and they act as a catalyst for sort of further regeneration, a bit bringing people into the city. There seems to be that demand there, and that people want to live within the city centre now and have good quality, residential space as well as amenity space to kind of go with them.
So would you agree? It sounds like the future's bright.
We want city centres that are diverse, that are rich, and to do that we need to densify them with a population. So to bring lots of people into the city centre works really well to create the kind of space that people want to live. They kind of support each other as concepts. They also work interestingly in the void that's created, so where you take people away from other less urban areas, there's a space there that can create regeneration. So it's a twofold thing, tall buildings. One, they create cities that are really interesting, they densify, but then they also create areas around the cities which can also be sort of replanned, reused, re-envisaged, which is quite important. There's a good example of that in Leeds. With, I think it was about 10, 20 years ago, there was a restriction on houses of multiple occupation in Headingley, which was a big sort of residential student area. And the council set policy to prevent that becoming overbearing for the local population, and that's really driven the need to build taller in the city. And you'll note that the majority of the tall buildings within Leeds are student accommodation, so you can see that in effect, you can see that happening, which is really interesting.
Well, that brings us to the next question about challenges that you guys face when it comes to designing and constructing buildings. So what are some of the big challenges you face? Darren, start us off on this.
Well, as a structural engineer, the biggest challenge, I guess, for us is always kind of wind. The taller you get is going to be wind, and there's two aspects to that. There's the environmental climate around these buildings, and obviously Leeds has got, again, a tragic history of wind around tall buildings, and so there's a very sort of key skill in being able to model sort of buildings in their environment, just make sure that sort of public safety, how those spaces are used, especially if we're creating placemaking spaces around them, that they're safe to be used on a day-to-day basis. And then the second side of that is the wind loading on a building and how a building moves and how people feel in the building. Do they feel safe? And part of that is also like a cultural change. There's not been a huge history of tall residential buildings in this country. When you go to New York, across the US, and the Middle East, there's lots of tall buildings, and so people are used to how those buildings respond in the wind. In the UK, there's almost like a learning process that these buildings move. It's 200 meters tall, it will move, and some people can feel that much in the same way that some people get car sick. Talking to our New York colleagues and sort of understanding how they do it and how we do it and comparing them there's a lot of similarities in taking the data and the experience that they've got and applying that to the UK. It's quite easy to design something to stand up. That's fine. To design something that someone else may perceive is unsafe is a much more abstract sort of challenge, and so that I think that's the key thing for us. With the experience we've got of designing these sort of tall buildings, how can we apply those rules on future buildings to make them efficient, embodied carbon. You know, that is a real challenge to try and get down to the targets that are being set. And we're looking at opportunities of how can we sort of minimise, they're going to be concrete. You know, we have to accept it's going to be concrete. So what can we do with the structural elements to make those elements as small as possible so there's less concrete, so you're still going as high, but there's less concrete in it.
Now, you talked about embodied carbon and obviously steel. You said they're going to be made out of concrete, fine. But what about glass? Because Wesley, you were talking earlier about how there's, you see a lot of glass towers and things like that as well. Glass is really bad for embodied carbon. Are we going to see less glass towers then, perhaps?
Yeah, we think you do just tied in regulation. Building regulations will probably force us to have less glass because it performs less well from a thermal perspective as a more solid material might do. So there's a lot of talk in especially Manhattan at the moment about the last glass towers that have been built and seeing more sort of punched holes in terms of windows in more solid looking buildings. So that will bring about its challenges. We're thinking about biodiversity a lot more these days. We think about our environment, which is good. We know glass towers have huge impacts on birds. Bird strikes are a big problem on glass towers. So there's something to think about there. Balancing energy gains is obviously really important in terms of how the building performs in terms of its energy efficiency. So I think we will see material change. That has to be tied in with the Building Safety Act factors and how we make things non-combustible. Time and cost are always a factor, and that will affect the materials that we use. So we are I think we're at a little bit of a crossroads, at a little bit of a new sort of a new place to try and understand what these new buildings look like. So I think we'll get some right, we'll get some wrong. We'll test and understand where things work, and then direction will follow. I think the one thing I would say in terms of glass itself is it's a very diverse material. It works exceptionally well technically. It works really well aesthetically for me on a tall building because of its reflective qualities. So we're starting to think now about scales of buildings a little bit like you think about the sort of strata within a rainforest. You've got the floor, you've got the sort of midsection, there's the canopies, and the building materials have to perform differently. So it brings it back into the mix for us as building designers from a placemaking perspective. Personally, I think it's fine to have a background of really tall buildings as long as the materials sit within the sky plane. So they've got to respond to the sky a bit more than they have to respond to the street. At the lower level, of course, they've got to work with the street and public space around it has to work. So material affects us at that level as well. So it's an intrinsic part of the design. With all things, balance will prevail and come up with the best solutions. What very few tall buildings have considered, especially in the UK, a bit more sort of on the continent and further afield, is how we deal with colour. So, we've established a principle that reflection of glass works well to sit in the sky space. We can take some lovely photographs, and we can, you can really pitch these buildings in the best light. Where they're not as successful, arguably, as in flat light, and with any multi-dimensional object, you're always going to get different spread of lights. For me, it's what makes them rich and interesting. But if you're just looking at the flat light and build it, I think we've not yet figured out how we introduce colour, and that's what's really interesting for me. There are tall buildings that have done it well, largely in the office front rather than residential as well, because it asks for a different scale of how you modulate the facade. The Torre Agbar, I think it's Torre Glorious, is it called now, in Barcelona, deals with colour really well, and that starts to reflect a bit of Spanish heritage, and it belongs to its place a bit more. So that's a really interesting one. There's a tall office building in Berlin, the GSW headquarters, by a company called Saarbrücken Hudson, and that's got it's a double skin facade, and it's got pastel sunshades on it, so it becomes a very diverse facade. The building looks different at different times of day depending on how people operate it, and when you start to do that, then you start to get under the skin of what good architecture really looks like. So I think for tall building design, we've got more to explore in the UK, but as we were saying, it takes so long to conceive them that we have to be very keen to get these opportunities at the right time and at the early stages and make sure they follow through. So yeah, more to come that's interesting on that front, I think.
Let's go into the national government side of things. So obviously we've seen the Building Safety Act come into place now. So how has that changed how we're approaching tall buildings?
It's a big impact. It's a change of mindset as a design team. there's going to be a big impact on sort of clients in how they procure the design services, with us having to demonstrate compliance with the building regulations prior to starting on site. So there's a financial impact there in being able to get the right input for all the life safety systems that go into these sort of buildings. I think ultimately, we always complied with the building regulations, and this legislation is just creating a process and a thread that shows how we've complied with them prior to us starting on site and as part of the development. So where we're making changes, recording those changes. So it's a behavioural mindset change that we have to accept as an industry.
It's the first time that I've seen government policy directly affect our industry, make everybody stop, make everybody think, and it's because it's been personalised. So the duty to demonstrate your competence, to prove that you've got the skills to undertake a specific task, to be a principal designer in my regard, has really got people thinking. Some people are scared, some people are trying to run away from it. We've taken the opportunity to embrace it, and I actually think it's a good thing. If people feel accountable, they'll perform better and they'll take things more seriously. Good professionals have done that anyway, and they really don't have anything to worry about. Or, as Darren says, all we're really trying to do is document the fact that we're doing it. So it, on the day-to-day, it adds an administrative responsibility. Grenfell's obviously generated the Building Safety Act. You can see from the inquiry there's a distinct need for it. I think my concern, my interest is it will be a good 5 or 10 years before the industry truly accepts it. And at the outset, people will try and find a way around it. I think that's what happened with CDM. The intent was good, but there was no way of enforcing behaviour. It seems by demonstrating competence and by having people personally sign documentation to stand by their work, that's changed. So a good thing in the long run. It just takes a period of adjustment as professionals to make sure we meet the benchmark. And there's a lot of confusion at the moment as to how those standards can be met, how we can satisfy the requirements of the Building Safety Act. So time's important. I think over the next 5 years, we'll all find that it actually makes for better built buildings, which is a good thing.
Well, in talking with you guys, it sounds like the future of tall buildings in the UK is looking really great. Because of the Building Safety Act, we're going to have more robust buildings, which is always great to see, of higher quality. And maybe we'll see some experimentation when it comes to color and shape. Bring on the hexagons. That being said, if you want to know more about buildings, whether they're tall or small, check out placenorth.co.uk, where we are your voice for the northern property market. And if you want to know more about what Darren's up to, check out dpsquared.net. I'm Julia Hatmaker. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a good rest of your day.